It had been only 30 minutes since the divorce was finalized, and I walked out of the New York County Courthouse with nothing but the clothes on my back. 3 years as a daughter-in-law in a wealthy family, and in the end, I left like an unwanted guest. My ex-husband turned his back without a word. My ex-sister-in-law sneered. And my ex-mother-in-law was so overjoyed that as she got into her car, she said something loud enough for anyone nearby to hear the bitterness in it. Finally, that little gold digger is out of our house. From now on, that $25 million is all ours. Hearing that, I remained silent. No arguments, no explanations. I just stood quietly on the other side of the street, watching them laugh and chat as if they'd just won the biggest gamble of their lives. But exactly 30 minutes after the judge's gavel fell, my ex-mother-in-law's phone rang. She answered gleefully, probably thinking it was the bank calling to confirm the large withdrawal she'd planned for a new mansion in the Hamptons. But just a few seconds later, her face turned deathly pale. The phone in her hand trembled, and then she shrieked a question in the middle of the parking garage that made her entire family freeze. "What do you mean? The $25 million is gone from the account?" From a distance, I just watched them. And for the first time in 3 years of being their daughter-in-law, I smiled, because there was a secret they never knew. The $25 million they thought was finally theirs had never, from the very beginning, belonged to them. And the only person with the power to decide its fate was me. That afternoon, the sky over Manhattan was a pale, flat gray. It wasn't raining, but the air was heavy and thick, promising a storm. In front of the courthouse, a stream of people moved in and out. The sounds of conversations, city traffic, and hurried footsteps blended into a chaotic symphony. I descended the stone steps one by one, the divorce decree, stamped in red, held tightly in my hand. A single thin sheet of paper, but it closed the chapter on a 3-year marriage I once thought would be my entire life. 3 years ago, I had married into the Hayes family with a heart full of hope. 3 years later, I was leaving with a small handbag, a few personal documents, and a heart so weary it no longer had the strength to feel pain. I paused at the courthouse gate, taking a deep breath. The hot, dry afternoon air stung my throat. Behind me, the courthouse doors opened again. The familiar click-clack of expensive heels echoed on the pavement. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. My ex-mother-in-law, Eleanor Hayes. A woman whose mere presence, for the past 3 years, was a signal for me to hold my tongue, to stay silent, to swallow every bit of resentment. But today, I didn't turn. I just stood still. A few seconds later, her voice, sharp, grating, and full of triumph, cut through the air behind me. "Well, it's finally done. I told you. A woman who can't even produce an heir would be kicked out of this family sooner or later." A few people nearby glanced over. I still didn't turn around. She walked right up beside me, the familiar scent of her expensive perfume wafting past. "What are you still standing here for? Waiting for someone to pity you?" she scoffed. "Or are you planning to go back and beg Carter for scraps?" Slowly, I turned to face her. For 3 years, I had always lowered my head in her presence. But today, for the first time, I looked directly into her eyes. Her gaze faltered for a second, as if she wasn't used to me no longer appearing weak. But a moment later, she laughed. "What are you looking at? You've lost the right to be a Hayes, and now you're trying to show some attitude." Just then, Carter, my ex-husband, walked out of the courthouse. He wore a crisp white shirt, phone in hand, his expression as cold and detached as if the day's events were nothing more than a simple administrative task. 3 years ago, I had loved this man so much I thought I could endure anything just to be by his side. But 3 years later, I understood that when love dies, some people become colder than strangers. Carter stopped in front of me. He looked at me for a few seconds, then said with utter calm, "Don't come back to the house again." I let out a soft, humorless laugh. In the 3 years I lived in that grand townhouse, not once did I feel like it was my home. I replied softly, "Don't worry. I have no intention of coming back." Hearing this, my ex-sister-in-law, Madison, who was standing behind them, burst into laughter. "Did you hear that, Mom?" She still has her pride. She crossed her arms, looking me up and down. 3 years of living off our family. You must have saved up a nice little nest egg, huh? My ex-mother-in-law shot me a disdainful look. Did you really think marrying into the Hayes family meant you'd get a piece of the fortune? She laughed loudly. Let me tell you something. From the spoon you ate with to the chair you sat on, it was all bought with our money. You walk out that door with nothing. A few bystanders began to whisper. But I remained silent. No rebuttal, no anger. I just watched them quietly. My silence only made Eleanor more smug. She turned to Carter and said loudly, "See? I told you. This kind of woman is only good at playing the victim." Then she cackled. Thank God we divorced her early. Otherwise, she'd be trying to claim a piece of our $25 million. At the mention of that figure, a few people nearby turned their heads, but she didn't care. She was too happy, too triumphant, too confident in her victory. Carter gently tugged her arm. Mom, that's enough. But she wasn't finished. Enough? No, we need to make things clear today. She turned back to me, her eyes sharp as ice. Listen closely. Now that you're divorced, that entire $25 million from the investment trust belongs completely to the Hayes family. She held her head high. It has nothing to do with you anymore. After hearing her out, I just nodded slightly. Is that so? She frowned, perhaps expecting me to cry or at least react, but I only said, very softly, congratulations. My response made Madison laugh hysterically. Mom, see? She's even politely congratulating us. My ex-mother-in-law joined in the laughter. Yes, you should congratulate us. She looked at me with mock pity. Because from now on, you're going to learn what it feels like to live with no money, no husband, and no one to lean on. I didn't answer. I just looked at the sleek, black Mercedes parked at the curb, its driver holding the door open. Eleanor walked towards it, speaking loudly to her daughter. Let's go. I need to stop by the bank to confirm the funds. Her voice was electric with excitement. Then we'll go look at that $5 million mansion in the Hamptons I've had my eye on. Madison squealed. Really, Mom? Eleanor laughed heartily. With $25 million in hand, what's a little mansion? All three of them got into the car. The door shut with a heavy thud. The Mercedes slowly pulled away from the curb, disappearing from the courthouse gates. I stood there, watching it go. The afternoon wind gently blew through my hair. The phone in my pocket vibrated. I took it out. It was a text from the bank. The message was just one line. Asset protection clause activated per terms of divorce finalization. I stared at the text for a long time, then a small smile touched my lips. Somewhere else in this city, perhaps in just a few minutes, my ex-mother-in-law's phone would also ring. And that call would force the entire Hayes family to face a truth they had never imagined. A truth that, for 3 years, I had never spoken aloud. The sleek, black Mercedes glided away from the courthouse, merging into the thick afternoon traffic of Manhattan. The angled sunlight reflected off the car's windows, illuminating Eleanor Hayes's beaming face. In 3 years, she had never felt so relieved. Leaning back against the leather seat, she crossed her arms and smiled with satisfaction. Finally got her out of the house. Sitting next to her, Madison, Carter's sister, cackled. I told you, Mom. She looks all innocent, but she was definitely after our money. Eleanor smirked. She can be after it all she wants, but that doesn't mean she'll get it. She glanced at her son in the front seat. Good thing you were decisive and ended it quickly. Carter said nothing, just staring out the window, his expression somber. For some reason, he felt a strange emptiness in his chest, not happiness, not relief, just a hollow void. 3 years ago, when he married Eliza Reed, he thought it would be a simple marriage. A quiet, gentle girl from an ordinary family who wouldn't cause any trouble. But now, 3 years later, it had all ended so quickly he hadn't even processed what he had lost or gained. Eleanor clapped her hands sharply. Oh, right. She turned to the driver. Head straight to Atlantic Trust Bank. Madison looked surprised. Why are we going to the bank, Mom? Eleanor grinned. To withdraw the money, of course. What else? Her voice was filled with excitement. That $25 million has been sitting in that investment trust for 3 years. Now that the divorce is final, control reverts completely to our family. She spoke as if she'd just won a great war. We have to confirm it right away and then put a down payment on that Hamptons mansion. Madison's eyes widened. The $5 million one? That's the one. Eleanor nodded firmly. It's a beautiful property, great location, huge garden, right near the water. When Carter gets a new wife, she'll need a home that reflects our status. Hearing this, Carter frowned slightly. Let's talk about that later, Mom. Eleanor waved her hand dismissively. Later? A man needs to marry and have children. And this time she lowered her voice, as if stating the obvious. I'll choose carefully. Someone from a good family, our kind of people, she scoffed. Not some penniless nobody, like the one we just got rid of. The car pulled up in front of the Atlantic Trust Bank building, a soaring glass tower in the heart of the financial district. The three of them stepped out, and a security guard immediately opened the door. Inside, the bank was cool and brightly lit. Eleanor marched straight to the private banking desk. Hello, I'd like to see the manager for our investment account. The receptionist smiled politely. Of course, ma'am. May I have your name? Eleanor Hayes. At the name, the receptionist nodded instantly. Please wait just a moment, Mrs. Hayes. A few minutes later, a man in his 40s, dressed in an impeccable suit, emerged. Mrs. Hayes, a pleasure. He shook her hand politely. I'm Mr. Davies, your senior client manager. Eleanor nodded. Let's speak in your office. The three of them were escorted into a luxurious private meeting room. Tea was served, but Eleanor didn't touch it. She placed her designer handbag firmly on the table and got straight to the point. I'm here to confirm our family's control over our investment trust. Her voice was thick with confidence. The $25 million. Mr. Davies paused for a second. Ah, the Hayes Family Trust. That's right, Eleanor confirmed. My son and daughter-in-law divorced today. She smiled faintly. The binding clause is no longer in effect. Madison chimed in, which means the money is now completely ours. Mr. Davies looked at them for a few seconds, a hint of unease in his eyes. Yes, I understand. He opened his laptop, his fingers tapping lightly on the keyboard. The room was silent for a few moments before he suddenly stopped, his brow furrowing. Eleanor frowned. Is there a problem? Mr. Davies stared at the screen for a few more seconds, then turned to them, his tone becoming very careful. Excuse me, Mrs. Hayes, but would you mind if I double-check something? Eleanor was growing impatient. Check what? This account has been with you for 3 years. Madison tossed her head. Exactly. Just confirm it, and we'll be on our way. But Mr. Davies stood up. I'll be right back. Please excuse me for a few minutes. The door closed, and a strange quiet fell over the room. Eleanor crossed her arms. For such a big bank, they certainly work slowly. Madison giggled. They're probably trembling at the size of the amount, Mom. The two of them laughed. Only Carter remained silent. He looked around the sleek glass room, a vague sense of unease beginning to stir within him. About 5 minutes later, the door opened. Mr. Davies returned, but this time, he was accompanied by a woman in her late 30s wearing a sharp black suit, her eyes intelligent and focused. Mr. Davies made the introduction. This is Miss Hanson, our bank's legal counsel. The word lawyer immediately put Eleanor on edge. A lawyer? What for? Her voice turned sharp. I'm here to access my funds, not to file a lawsuit. Miss Hanson sat down and opened a file in front of her. We just need to confirm a few details. She looked directly at Eleanor. You mentioned that your son finalized his divorce from Miss Eliza Reed today. Is that correct? Yes, it's officially effective. Miss Hanson nodded slowly. Then she said something very quietly, but the words seemed to freeze the air in the room. In that case, the asset reversionary clause has been triggered. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. What clause? Miss Hanson turned a page in the file. Clause 7 inches, the trust agreement. Her voice was clear, enunciating every word. In the event that Miss Eliza Reed is divorced under duress, or is no longer in a marital relationship with the Hayes family, the entire capital of the trust will be immediately frozen, and control will revert to the designated representative of the original benefactor. The room was silent. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Eleanor burst out laughing. What are you talking about? Miss Hanson closed the file, her expression calm. What I mean is, she paused, then stated plainly, the $25 million is no longer under your family's control. The teacup on the table rattled. Madison shot to her feet. What? Eleanor slammed her hand on the table. That's impossible. Miss Hanson looked at them. I'm very sorry. Then she delivered the final blow, a sentence that left the entire Hayes family utterly stunned. Because the person with the legal authority over this money, from the very beginning, was never the Hayes family. She paused, her gaze like steel. It was Eliza Reed. Carter stood frozen. A ringing filled his ears. Only one thought raced through his mind: impossible. Because for 3 years, he had believed his wife was just an ordinary girl, a quiet woman, someone who came with nothing. But if what the bank was saying was true, then who exactly was the woman he had just divorced? The private banking suite was now deathly silent. Gone was the laughter, the smug satisfaction from moments before. All that remained was a tension so thick you could hear the hum of the air conditioning overhead. Eleanor Hayes stood rigid by the glass table, her hands pressed against its cool surface, her eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at Miss Hanson. What did you just say? Her voice trembled with rage. The $25 million doesn't belong to my family? Miss Hanson's expression didn't change. She simply pushed the file towards Eleanor. You can review Clause 7 yourself. Eleanor snatched the file, flipping through the pages so fast they rustled loudly. With every line she read, her face grew paler. Madison, standing beside her, leaned in to look, and after a few seconds, she cried out, "This can't be right. It clearly says it's an investment trust for Hayes Industries." Miss Hanson nodded. Correct. The trust is named for Hayes Industries. She paused for effect, but the source capital came from another investor. The room fell silent again, a heavy, suffocating quiet. Carter, standing behind them, felt a chill run down his spine. His eyes were glued to the document. Another investor? Miss Hanson looked at him. That's right. She turned to another page. 3 years ago, when Hayes Industries was facing a financial crisis, after a failed real estate venture, the company was on the brink of bankruptcy. Hearing this, Carter clenched his fists. He remembered it well. The company had almost collapsed. It was also the exact time he married Eliza. His father had told him they'd found an investor to save the company, and he'd never asked for more details. Miss Hanson continued, An investor put up $25 million to save the company. She looked directly at them. That money was placed in an investment trust under the name of Hayes Industries. Madison immediately interjected. Then that money belongs to us. Miss Hanson shook her head slightly. No. It was a custodial trust. She spoke slowly, emphasizing each word. Hayes Industries only had the right to use the capital for business operations. The actual ownership of the funds remained with the original investor. The room was quiet for another few seconds before Eleanor slammed her hand on the table again. Then who is this investor? Miss Hanson looked straight at her. The legal representative of that investment, she paused, then said with absolute clarity, is Eliza Reed. The name dropped into the room like a bomb. Madison stumbled back a step. No way. Eleanor shook her head repeatedly. No. Impossible. Her voice was practically a scream. That girl is dirt poor. Her family doesn't have 2 cents to rub together, let alone $25 million. Miss Hanson remained unfazed by her outburst. She said calmly, the funds do not belong to Miss Reed personally. She opened another file. It was an investment from Reed Capital. Carter frowned. The name sounded familiar, very familiar. Suddenly, he remembered. Reed Capital, a major private equity firm known for bailing out struggling companies. But the firm belonged to the Reed family of Boston, an extremely private, old money dynasty. Carter stared at the lawyer. Are you saying, he swallowed hard, that Eliza Reed is connected to that Reed Capital? Miss Hanson nodded slightly. She is the legal heir. The air in the room seemed to solidify. Eleanor stood frozen. Madison's jaw dropped. Only Carter remained still, but 100 memories were flooding his mind. 3 years ago, the first time he met Eliza. She was wearing a simple white dress, minimal makeup, and spoke softly. He'd asked her, "What does your family do?" She had just smiled and said, "My family is in business." He hadn't pressed further, assuming she was from a middle-class family. But if what the bank was saying was true, then the woman he had lived with for 3 years was the heir to a multi-million-dollar investment firm. Carter's heart began to pound. A vague sense of regret started to spread through his chest. Eleanor still refused to believe it. She lunged towards the table, pointing at the lawyer. "I don't believe you," she shrieked. "That girl was my daughter-in-law for 3 years. I know her better than anyone." Miss Hanson looked at her with an unreadable expression. "You know her?" A small, wry smile appeared on her lips. "If you truly knew her," she pushed a single sheet of paper across the table, "perhaps you wouldn't have been in such a hurry to force a divorce." Eleanor looked down at the paper. It was a copy of the investment agreement. At the bottom in small print was a line, "Legal Representative, Eliza M. Reed." Her hand trembled, and the paper fluttered from her grasp. Madison stammered. So, what about the $25 million now?" Miss Hanson's answer was simple. "It has been frozen." She added one more sentence, a sentence that felt like the floor dropping out from under the Hayes family. "And full control has been transferred back to Miss Reed." Carter stood motionless, his mind reeling. Just an hour ago, he thought he had escaped a meaningless marriage. Now, he was beginning to understand. The woman he had just signed divorce papers with was likely the person who had silently saved his entire family's company 3 years ago. And Eleanor, the woman who had been laughing triumphantly outside the courthouse, was now completely broken. She collapsed into a chair, muttering, "Impossible, impossible." But the truth was brutally clear. Not only did the $25 million not belong to them, but it was now entirely in the hands of the daughter-in-law they had just kicked out of their lives. The silence in the private banking suite was suffocating. After Miss Hanson delivered her final statement, no one spoke. There was only the soft whoosh of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of papers on the table. Eleanor Hayes sat frozen in her chair, her face ashen, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but couldn't form the words. For over 20 years, she was used to people listening to her, used to money and power being firmly in her family's grasp. But today, for the first time, she felt the ground crumbling beneath her. "No," she shook her head repeatedly. "It can't be." Madison, standing beside her, was equally frantic. "Carter, say something." But Carter remained still. He stared at the contract on the table, the bolded letters stark and clear. "Legal Representative, Eliza M. Reed." He read the name over and over, a name he had spoken every day for 3 years. A woman who had slept in his bed, eaten at his table, lived in his house, but he was only now realizing that he had never truly known her. Miss Hanson closed her file. "We have provided you with all the necessary information," she said calmly. "If you have no further questions, we will conclude this meeting." Madison shrieked. "Conclude what? That $25 million is our company's money. You can't just take it away like this." Miss Hanson looked at her, her gaze unwavering. "We are not taking anything," she said slowly. "We are simply returning it to its rightful owner." Madison was struck dumb. Eleanor, however, suddenly shot to her feet, knocking her chair over with a loud crash. "No!" she yelled. "That girl has no right to take my family's money." Miss Hanson sighed softly. "Mrs. Hayes," she looked her straight in the eye, "perhaps you should recall that 3 years ago, it was your family that signed the contract, accepting these investment funds." She opened the file again, pointing to a signature. "This is your husband's signature." Eleanor looked down. The familiar signature of her husband, the late Mr. Hayes, was undeniably there. Back then, with the company on the verge of bankruptcy, no one would invest, no one would help. Then, a mysterious investment fund appeared out of nowhere, $25 million, enough to save everything. The Hayes family had been so overjoyed they hadn't paid much attention to the complex clauses, as long as the company survived. But they never knew that the fund had a special provision, a clause known only to 3 parties: the bank, the lawyers, and Eliza Reed. Miss Hanson stood up. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes," she said softly. But from this point forward, your family no longer has access to these funds. With that, she walked out of the room. The door closed, and the room was once again plunged into a heavy silence. Madison turned to her mother. "Mom, what do we do now?" Eleanor didn't answer. Her eyes were glazed over. A moment later, she snapped back to reality. "Let's go," she said, her voice turning sharp and desperate. "We have to find her." Carter looked up. "You mean?" "Eliza Reed." Eleanor ground out through her teeth. "She can't have gone far. She has to explain this." She grabbed her handbag. Madison nodded frantically. "Yes, Mom. She must have been hiding this for 3 years." But Carter remained still. He said nothing, just stared out the glass window. The afternoon sun was beginning to soften. A memory surfaced. 3 years ago, on the day he proposed to Eliza, she had asked him just one question. "Are you sure you want to marry me?" He had laughed. "Why wouldn't I be?" She was quiet for a moment, then said, "What if, one day, you find out I'm not who you think I am? Will you regret it?" He hadn't understood her question then. He had just smiled and said, "All I need is you." But now, a lump formed in Carter's throat. Perhaps the one with the most regrets right now was him. Eleanor turned to him. "Carter, what are you waiting for? Let's go find her." Carter slowly nodded. The three of them hurried out of the bank. The Mercedes once again navigated the crowded streets. But this time, there was no laughter, no triumph, only panic. Because they had just realized something terrifying. The daughter-in-law they had scorned for 3 years might be the very person who held the fate of the entire Hayes family in her hands. But when the car returned to the courthouse, Eliza was long gone. The coffee shop across the street was empty. No one knew where she had gone, or what she would do next. Only one thing was certain. From this moment on, the game had completely changed, and the one in control was no longer the Hayes family. The Mercedes screeched to a halt in front of the courthouse, the doors flying open. Eleanor Hayes practically tumbled out, her face stripped of its usual arrogance, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes wide with panic. Where is she? She scanned the area. The courthouse entrance was still busy, but Eliza Reed was nowhere in sight. Madison ran across the street to the coffee shop and pushed open the door, her eyes darting around the room. "Excuse me, was there a young woman in a white dress sitting here a little while ago?" The barista nodded. "Yes, there was." "Where is she now?" "She left." Madison whipped around and looked at her mother. "She's gone." Eleanor froze. "Gone where?" The barista shook his head. "I don't know. I just saw her take a phone call and then leave." Eleanor clenched her fists. "Damn it." Carter stood behind them, silent. He looked at the empty chair by the window. The iced tea on the table was untouched. The ice cubes nearly melted, indicating she had left only recently. A strange sense of loss washed over him. 3 years of living together, yet he had never truly paid attention to her, never asked what she liked to drink, never noticed where she liked to sit. But now, looking at that empty chair, he felt as if he had missed something profoundly important. Eleanor turned to her son. "Carter, what are you just standing there for? Call her." Carter took out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly. He found Eliza's name in his contacts. For 3 years, that name had been at the top of his list. But today, it felt like calling a complete stranger. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then a cold, automated voice. "The subscriber you have dialed is not available." Carter hung up. Madison huffed in frustration. She must have turned her phone off. Eleanor grit her teeth. That girl. She definitely planned this from the start. She turned to Carter. "I want you to have someone look into her. Immediately." Carter was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." An hour later, in the executive office of Hayes Industries, Carter sat at his desk. His computer screen was filled with documents that had just been sent over. Beside him stood Liam, his trusted assistant. Liam placed a file on the desk. "Mr. Hayes." His voice was hesitant. "I've done a preliminary background check on Miss Reed." Carter looked up. "And?" Liam took a breath. "There are a few surprises." Eleanor, who was pacing nearby, immediately strode over. "What surprises?" Liam opened the file. The first page had a single bolded title, Reed Capital. Eleanor frowned. What is that? Liam looked at her. It's one of the largest private equity firms on the East Coast. Madison scoffed. So? Liam turned to the next page. In the center was a photograph of an older man in a suit, his expression stern. Below the picture was a caption, Arthur Reed, founder of Reed Capital. Carter stared at the photo. Suddenly, he remembered. 3 years ago, at his wedding, an elderly man had attended. He had stood at a distance, watching Eliza for a long time. Later, he shook Carter's hand and said one thing, take good care of her. At the time, Carter assumed he was just a distant relative. But now, Liam turned to the next page. Arthur Reed had one granddaughter. He placed his finger on the next photo. Carter leaned in to look. It was a picture of Eliza, standing at the podium of a business conference. Behind her was the logo for Reed Capital. Carter shot to his feet. What? Liam spoke slowly. Miss Eliza Reed is the sole heir to Reed Capital. The entire room fell silent. Madison stammered, That's impossible. For 3 years, she was a housewife in our home. She did the grocery shopping, she cooked. Liam sighed. It appears she chose to live that way. Carter's head was spinning. 3 years. For 3 years, he had let the heir to $1 billion investment firm cook his meals, clean his house, and endure the contempt of his mother. A heavy weight of regret settled in his chest. Eleanor still couldn't believe it. She snatched the file. Impossible. But when she flipped to the last page, she froze. It was a copy of the inheritance documents, the name of the beneficiary, Eliza M. Reed. The estimated net worth, over $250 million. Her hand trembled, and the file slipped to the floor. Madison whispered, horrified. So for the last 3 years, we've been treating a woman worth $250 million like a housemaid? No one answered. Only Carter stood there, numb. A single thought echoed in his mind. He had just divorced the woman who could have changed his entire life. And worse, he was the one who had pushed her away. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a black Maybach pulled up in front of a skyscraper. The door opened, and Eliza Reed stepped out. A man in a suit bowed his head. Welcome, Miss Reed. Eliza nodded slightly. Is everything ready? The man smiled. Yes, ma'am. He handed her a folder. Hayes Industries is about to enter a difficult phase. Eliza looked up at the towering building, her expression calm. 3 years as a daughter-in-law, 3 years of Ren-Nai. She had never planned for revenge, but some people only understand the value of what they had, once they lose it all. She murmured softly. This is only the beginning. The next morning, the headquarters of Hayes Industries was in chaos. Accountants scurried between departments, desk phones rang incessantly, and department heads gathered in front of the boardroom with tense faces. Inside the CEO's office, Carter stared at his computer screen, which was filled with red-flagged emails. With every line he read, his expression darkened. Suddenly, the door burst open. Liam rushed in, looking more serious than Carter had ever seen him. Mr. Hayes. His voice was hoarse. We have a problem. Carter looked up. What is it? Liam dropped a file on the desk. Atlantic Trust Bank just sent a notice. The company's $30 million revolving credit line has been suspended. Carter frowned. On what grounds? Liam took a deep breath. Because the $25 million investment trust has been frozen. The room was silent. A second, 2, 3. Carter clenched his fist. They're suspending our credit over that? Liam shook his head. It's not just that. He pulled up another email. Bank of North America has also frozen our line of credit, and 3 of our real estate partners have sent letters demanding early payment on their contracts. Carter shot to his feet. What? Liam looked at him grimly. You know how it is, sir. For the past 3 years, the company's cash flow has been heavily leveraged against that $25 million trust. Now that it's been removed as collateral, he trailed off. The entire financial structure of Hayes Industries is starting to collapse. The words hit Carter like a sledgehammer. He stood frozen, never having imagined things could get this serious. For 3 years, the company had grown rapidly, expanding into new projects. But now, he realized it had all been built on a foundation he never understood. That $25 million his family had always thought of as their own was, in reality, just a temporary investment. Liam spoke quietly. If we can't secure a new source of capital within 2 months, he didn't have to finish. Carter knew what it meant. The company would go bankrupt. At the same time, in the Hayes family townhouse, Eleanor was pacing back and forth in the living room. The coffee table was littered with documents and her phone. She had just finished a call. "What?" she had shrieked into the phone. "You won't extend our loan either? We've been doing business together for 10 years. You can't just turn your back on us now." But a few seconds later, she had lowered the phone. The line had gone dead. Madison, sitting on the sofa, was pale. "What is it, Mom?" Eleanor didn't answer. She collapsed into a chair, beads of sweat on her forehead. In 20 years, she had never seen things this bad. In the past, whenever the company ran into trouble, the investment trust was always there to back them up. But now, that lifeline was gone. Madison's voice trembled. "Mom, is this because of her? Because of Eliza?" Eleanor grit her teeth. Who else could it be? She slammed her hand on the table. "That girl. She's doing this on purpose." But as she said it, she fell silent. A terrifying thought crept into her mind. What if Eliza had known everything from the very beginning? Then what was the purpose of her 3 years of quiet endurance in their home? A chill ran down her spine. That evening, Carter came home late. As he walked into the living room, Eleanor immediately stood up. "How is the company?" Carter loosened his tie. "Not good." Just 2 words, but they were enough to make Eleanor's face drain of color. Madison asked anxiously. "How bad is it?" Carter looked at them and said bluntly, "If we don't find new capital in the next 60 days, the company will go bankrupt." The room seemed to freeze. "No, that's impossible," Madison whispered in horror. Eleanor's voice trembled. "So what do we do now?" Carter was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "There's only one way." His mother and sister stared at him. "What way?" Carter looked down at the table, his voice low. "We find Eliza." Madison immediately objected. "Find her? What for?" But Eleanor remained quiet, because she understood. If the investment trust belonged to Eliza, then the only person who could save the company was her. She clenched her fists. A woman as proud as her had never imagined a day when she would have to go begging to her former daughter-in-law. But now, she had no other choice. That night, in a luxurious office tower in the heart of the city, Eliza stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, the glittering lights of the metropolis spread out below her. The man standing behind her spoke softly. "Miss Reed, Hayes Industries has entered a state of crisis." Eliza didn't turn around, her gaze fixed on the streams of traffic below. 3 years ago, she had married into the Hayes family, hoping for a quiet life. But 3 years later, she had left with a heart that was completely changed. The man asked, "Shall we proceed with the next phase?" Eliza smiled faintly, a calm, measured smile. "There's no need," she said softly. "All we have to do is stand still. They'll collapse on their own." At the same time, in the Hayes townhouse, Eleanor sat in the darkened living room. She stared at her phone, and finally, with a trembling hand, she dialed a number she had never thought she would call in 3 years. Across town, Eliza Reed's phone began to ring. That night, the lights were on in the Hayes family townhouse, but the atmosphere was cold and devoid of warmth. The grand, luxurious living room, with its imported Italian sofa, felt strangely sterile. Eleanor Hayes sat alone, her phone in front of her, the screen lit up with a name she had never willingly called in 3 years, Eliza Reed. She stared at the name for a long time. For 3 years as her daughter-in-law, Eliza had always been the one to call her first to ask if she needed anything, to ask what she wanted for dinner, to ask if she needed a ride to a doctor's appointment. But Eleanor had never responded with a shred of kindness. In her eyes, Eliza was just a poor girl who got lucky marrying her son, a barren woman with no status, no value. But now, that very woman held the $25 million that could decide the life or death of Hayes Industries. She gripped the phone, a knot of humiliation tightening in her throat. Eleanor had never imagined she would have to beg her former daughter-in-law for anything. But if she didn't, the company would fall. Carter stood by the window, staring silently into the night. Madison paced the room, the tension so thick no one dared to speak above a whisper. Finally, Eleanor pressed the call button. The ringing echoed in the silent room, each tone making her heart pound harder. Madison whispered, "Mom, do you think she'll answer?" Carter said nothing, his eyes fixed on the phone in his mother's hand. The phone rang a few more times, and then, click, the call connected. A familiar voice, calm and gentle, came through the line. "Hello?" The living room fell silent. They had heard that voice thousands of times over the past 3 years, but it had never sounded so distant. Eleanor's throat was tight. She didn't know how to begin. Eliza spoke again. "Is everything all right?" Her tone was still polite, but it lacked the warmth it once had. The distance was palpable. Eleanor took a deep breath. "Eliza," she said her name, a name she had always uttered with a cold, dismissive tone. But this time, her voice was softer. "Where are you?" There was a pause on the other end before Eliza replied simply, "Is there something you need?" Eleanor clenched her fist. "The company is having some trouble." Madison's eyes widened. She had never heard her mother speak to Eliza so meekly, but Eliza's voice remained even. "What does that have to do with me?" The simple question made Eleanor freeze. For 3 years, Eliza had always said our house, our company. But today, it was your company. The line had been drawn. Eleanor struggled to keep her composure. "Eliza, about the investment trust, can you meet with me for a moment?" Another pause, then Eliza asked, "What for?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. A woman as proud as her was not used to explaining herself. But this time, she had to. "We need to talk." A long silence, then Eliza replied, "All right, just one word. Where?" Eleanor let out a sigh of relief. "At the house. Tomorrow." But Eliza immediately cut her off. "No." Eleanor faltered. "Then where do you want to meet?" Eliza's reply was clear and firm. "At my office." The statement silenced the entire room. My office. 2 simple words, but they served as a stark reminder. Eliza was no longer the daughter-in-law of the Hayes family. She didn't have to step foot in that house, didn't have to take their orders, didn't have to bow her head to anyone. Eleanor forced her voice to remain steady. "Fine. What's the address?" "I'll send it to you tomorrow," Eliza said. She paused for a moment, her tone still calm. "But before we meet, there's one thing I want to make clear." Eleanor felt her heart clench. "What is it?" Eliza spoke slowly. "You don't need to explain, and you don't need to apologize." The words made Eleanor stop, but it was the next sentence that sent a chill down the spines of all 3 of them. "Because I have no intention of coming back." With that, the call ended. Beep, beep, beep. The dial tone echoed in the living room. Eleanor still held the phone. Madison's voice trembled. "Mom, what did she mean by that?" Carter stared at the floor, a complex emotion rising within him. It wasn't just worry for the company, it was a profound sense of regret. For the first time, he realized something. The woman he had always thought of as weak had never actually needed the Hayes family, and now they were the ones who desperately needed her. Meanwhile, on the top floor of the Reed Capitol Tower, Eliza put her phone down. Her assistant, standing nearby, asked, "Miss Reed, they will be here tomorrow." Eliza nodded. "I know." The assistant hesitated. Are you going to help them?" Eliza looked out the window. Below, the city was a brilliant tapestry of light. 3 years ago, she thought the Hayes family would be her home for life. Now, it all felt like a dream from which she had woken. She said softly, "Whether I help them or not, they'll find out tomorrow." The next morning, the sky over New York was an unusually clear blue. Early sunlight glinted off the glass facades of skyscrapers, making them sparkle like giant mirrors. In front of the Reed Capitol Tower, a black Mercedes pulled to a stop. The door opened, and Eleanor Hayes stepped out first. She tilted her head back to look at the building, which soared more than 30 stories into the air. At its peak, large, gleaming steel letters spelled out, "Reed Capitol." Eleanor swallowed hard. In 3 years, she had never heard Eliza mention this place. If not for yesterday's background check, she would still believe her former daughter-in-law was just an ordinary girl. Madison got out next, her eyes wide as she took in the opulent lobby. Polished marble floors gleamed, and massive crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceiling. Employees in tailored suits moved with a quiet, efficient energy. This place was in a different league from any of Hayes Industries' offices. Carter was the last to exit the car. He looked up at the building, a strange feeling stirring inside him. 3 years. 3 years he had lived with Eliza, yet he never knew she belonged to a world like this. The three of them entered the lobby. A receptionist immediately bowed her head. "Good morning. How may I help you?" Eleanor said. "We have an appointment with Eliza Reed." The receptionist smiled. "Of course. Miss Reed is expecting you. Please take the elevator to the 28th floor." The term Miss Reed made Eleanor flinch. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside. No one spoke, the only sound the soft hum of the lift. Madison whispered, "Mom, do you think she'll help us?" Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't know either. The elevator stopped, and the doors slid open to a long hallway with plush gray carpeting and glass-walled offices on either side. At the end of the hall was a large set of double doors with a plaque that read, "Chief Executive Officer." An assistant was waiting. "Please, this way." The doors opened, and the three of them stepped inside. The office was vast, flooded with sunlight from a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. In the center of the room was a large, modern desk, and sitting behind it was Eliza Reed. She wore a simple but elegant cream-colored pantsuit, her hair tied back neatly. Her expression was calm, devoid of the gentle submissiveness she had displayed at the Hayes home. In its place was the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to power. Carter froze for a moment. He almost didn't recognize the woman in front of him. Eliza just looked at them, her gaze perfectly level. "Sit," she said, her voice soft but clear. The three of them sat. No one spoke first. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "Eliza," her voice was hoarse. "How have you been?" The simple question was so out of character that Madison almost laughed. In 3 years, her mother had never once asked that. Eliza's reply was curt. "I'm fine. No longer, Mom." Just a polite, detached response. Eleanor bit her lip. "Eliza, about the company." Before she could finish, Eliza gently placed a file on the desk. "This is the latest financial report for Hayes Industries." Eleanor stopped short. You already know?" Eliza looked at her. "I've known for a long time." Carter frowned. "A long time?" Eliza nodded. The moment the trust's reversionary clause was triggered, she opened the file to a specific page. Currently, Hayes Industries has a capital shortfall of approximately $32 million. Madison's eyes widened. You know everything?" Eliza gave a small, humorless smile. "All of your lenders are my partners." The statement silenced all three of them. Eleanor clasped her hands together. "Eliza, can you help the company?" It was a question she never thought she would have to ask in her entire life. A plea for help, but Eliza didn't answer right away. She looked out the window for a long moment before speaking. "I can help." The three of them looked at her instantly. Madison almost sighed in relief. But Eliza's next sentence made them all freeze. "On one condition," Eleanor asked quickly. "What condition?" Eliza turned back to face them, her expression calm to the point of being cold. Hayes Industries must be sold to Reed Capital. The room was silent. 1 second, 2, 3. Madison jumped to her feet. "What?" Eleanor's face went pale. "You want to buy our company?" Eliza nodded. "Yes." Her voice was perfectly steady. "In exchange, I will inject the necessary capital to save it." Carter stared at her. His eyes held no anger, only a vague, aching pain. "And what happens after that?" Eliza looked directly at him and gave a simple answer. "After that, you'll be an employee." The words fell like a guillotine. The man who was her husband, the man who was the vice president of Hayes Industries, would now be just an employee. Eleanor shot to her feet. "Never!" she shrieked. "That is my family's company." But Eliza just looked at her, her gaze placid. "You can refuse." She closed the file. "But in 2 months, the company will be bankrupt." The room fell into silence. Because for the first time, the Hayes family understood. The power to decide was no longer in their hands. In the vast CEO's office of Reed Capital, the air remained thick with tension. The morning sun streamed through the massive windows, falling on the desk where Eliza Reed sat, a portrait of calm in stark contrast to the three people opposite her. Eleanor Hayes was still standing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Never. That company belongs to my family. Eliza didn't react, her gaze so placid it only fueled Eleanor's rage. Madison turned to her brother. Carter, do something. But Carter remained seated, his hands resting on the table, his eyes fixed on the file. His mind was in turmoil. He knew, with absolute certainty, that what Eliza proposed was their only reality. The family had no other sources of funding. Without Reed Capital, Hayes Industries would indeed collapse. Eleanor turned back to Eliza, her eyes blazing with fury. You're doing this for revenge, aren't you? Eliza's brow furrowed slightly. Revenge? She repeated the word as if tasting it. After a moment, she shook her head. No, her voice was very soft. This is just business. The answer left Eleanor speechless. 3 years ago, when the Hayes family accepted the $25 million investment, that too was a business transaction. They just never imagined the tables would turn so completely. Madison suddenly stood up. Stop pretending. You're only doing this because you hate my mother. Eliza looked at her. Her expression was not one of anger, but of a cool, detached calm. Is that what you think? Madison crossed her arms. Isn't it? For 3 years in our house, you acted so weak and helpless. Now we see your true colors. The accusation hung in the silent room. Eliza looked at Madison for a few seconds, then slowly rose from her chair. She walked over to the great window, the city sprawling beneath her. 3 years. 3 years as a daughter-in-law in the Hayes family. Memories flooded her mind, the dinners where she had to clear the table while the rest of them sat and talked. The times Eleanor had criticized her in front of relatives. The evenings she sat alone in a large, empty room while Carter came home late without so much as a text. And all the times she was made to feel like an outsider in her own home. Eliza turned back, a flicker of emotion finally showing in her eyes. Do you know why I never said anything for 3 years? No one answered. She continued, because I believed that family was a place where people could change, that if I was just patient enough, things would get better. She let out a small, sad laugh. But I was wrong. The room was silent. Eleanor was still standing, but the fury in her eyes was beginning to waver. Eliza looked directly at her. Do you remember the day I first moved into your house? Eleanor said nothing. Eliza went on. That day, you said something to me. She paused, then repeated the words verbatim. In this house, from the chair you sit on to the glass you drink from, it was all bought with Hayes family money. Madison flinched slightly. She remembered her mother saying that. At the time, they hadn't thought Eliza would take it to heart. Eliza nodded slowly. I remember it very clearly. For 3 years, I never forgot those words. She walked back to her desk and placed a hand on the file. So today, you should all understand one thing. She looked at them, her voice calm but resolute. In business, there are no feelings. There is only value. The words made the air even heavier. Eleanor's voice trembled. Eliza, do you really want to see the company go bankrupt? Eliza didn't answer right away. She looked at her for a long moment before saying, I've already given you a choice. Eleanor bit her lip, her hands shaking. In her entire life, she had never bowed her head to anyone. But now, her family's company, her late husband's legacy, her son's career, it was all in the hands of the woman before her. 1 second, 2, 3. Then, something no one in the room expected happened. Eleanor Hayes dropped to her knees. Mom! Madison screamed. Carter shot to his feet. Mom! But Eleanor remained on the floor. Tears streamed down her face. Her voice shook. Eliza, I'm begging you. The entire room was stunned into silence. In 3 years, this woman had never called Eliza her daughter. But today, she was using that word to beg. Please, save the company. Save this family. She bowed her head. I was wrong. It was all my fault. Carter stood frozen. He had never seen his mother so broken. As for Eliza, she stood there, watching the woman who had scorned her for 3 years kneel before her. There was no joy in her eyes, only a deep, profound calm. She said very softly, "Get up." Eleanor shook her head. "Not until you agree to help." The room was quiet. Then Eliza said something that stunned them all. "You don't need to kneel." She looked at them, her voice soft but clear. "I already told you. I will save the company." All three of them looked up. But her next sentence brought them crashing back down to earth. "But the condition remains the same. Hayes Industries must be sold to Reed Capital." The room fell silent again, because they all understood. This time, Eliza was not their daughter-in-law. She was the one who decided their fate. The CEO's office of Reed Capital was still suffocatingly quiet. Eleanor Hayes remained on her knees, hands clasped, her eyes red from crying. Madison stood behind her, completely stunned, and Carter could only watch as his mother knelt before his ex-wife, a painful knot twisting in his gut. Eliza stood behind her desk, her expression unreadable. Not angry, not triumphant, just a deep calm that was impossible to penetrate. "Get up," she said again, her voice gentle. Eleanor shook her head. "Not until you help, my dear." For the second time, she used an endearment, but it was no longer the possessive term of a mother-in-law, only a desperate plea. Carter stepped forward. "Mom, please, get up." He put a hand on her shoulder, but she wouldn't budge. "Eliza, please." The room was silent. After a long moment, Eliza sighed softly. She walked around her desk and stood before Eleanor. She bent down and took her hands. "Please, get up." Her voice was quiet, but it was enough to make Eleanor look up. Their eyes met. In 3 years of living under the same roof, it was the first time they had truly looked at each other for so long. Finally, Eleanor shakily allowed herself to be helped up and back into a chair, her hands still trembling. Eliza returned to her desk and opened the file. "My condition is unchanged. Reed Capital will acquire Hayes Industries. In return, I will provide the capital to save the company." Madison burst out, "You're being unreasonable. We've humbled ourselves like this, and you still." But Carter held up a hand, stopping his sister. "Maddie, that's enough." Madison fell silent, stunned by the tone of his voice. It wasn't anger. It was the sound of someone who had finally understood something. Carter looked at Eliza for a long time, his mind replaying countless memories. 3 years ago, on their wedding day, Eliza wore a simple white dress and stood beside him, smiling softly. After the ceremony, she had asked him, "Do you have any regrets?" He had laughed. "I'm only worried you'll have them." But now, he knew he was the one filled with regret. He stepped closer to the desk. "I need to ask you something." Eliza looked at him. "Go ahead." Carter took a deep breath. "For 3 years, why didn't you ever tell me the truth?" The question hung in the air. Eliza looked at him, and after a moment she replied, "Do you honestly think anything would have been different if I had?" Carter froze. He couldn't answer, because deep down, he knew she was right. It would have been the same. The problem was never about money. It was about how they had treated her. Carter clenched his fists, then said something he had never said in 3 years. "I'm sorry." The room was stunned. Madison stared at him, disbelieving. Eleanor looked up. Carter Hayes never apologized to anyone. But this time, he bowed his head. "I'm sorry." His voice was low and thick with emotion, "for never once standing up for you in 3 years." Eliza looked at him, and for a fleeting second, her composure wavered. But just as quickly, it was gone. "That doesn't matter anymore." Carter gave a bitter laugh. "Maybe not to you, but it matters to me." He looked around the office. "I used to think divorcing you was a release." He paused. "But now I realize I was the biggest fool in our marriage." The words left Madison speechless. Eleanor lowered her head in shame. She knew that if she hadn't pushed her son to get a divorce, things might have been different. Eliza closed the file. "Let's get back to the company," she said. "My time is limited." Carter looked at her. "I agree." The room was shocked. "Carter!" Madison cried out. But he continued. "I agree to sell Hayes Industries to Reed Capital." Eleanor looked up. "Carter, son." Carter turned to his mother. "We don't have a choice." Then he looked back at Eliza. But I have one condition. Eliza raised an eyebrow. What is it? Carter said. After the acquisition, let me continue to work there. He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. Not as vice president, just as an employee. I don't care. The room was quiet. Eliza studied him for a long time, then said something that surprised everyone. You don't have to be an employee. Carter stopped. What do you mean? Eliza looked at him. After Reed Capital takes over, I'll need someone who understands the company inside and out. She continued. You'll remain as CEO. Carter was stunned. You trust me? Eliza offered a small, cool smile. No, she said bluntly, I trust your competence. The answer was pragmatic and clear. Carter stood there, a storm of emotions churning inside him. Perhaps this was the first time he truly understood the woman in front of him, but it was too late. The story, however, was not over. Because after Reed Capital acquired Hayes Industries, another secret within the Hayes family was about to be revealed, a secret even more shocking than the $25 million. After the meeting at Reed Capital, a fragile calm settled over the room, though the weight of the day's events still lingered. On the desk, the acquisition contract for Hayes Industries lay between them. A single signature, and everything would change. Carter sat opposite Eliza, staring at the paper for a long time. 3 years ago, he had signed a marriage license with her. 3 years later, he was signing a contract that would rewrite the future of his family's company. He picked up the pen, but before he signed, he asked, Can I ask you one more thing? Eliza looked up. Go ahead. Carter looked her directly in the eye. For the past 3 years, did you ever truly love me? The question silenced the room. Madison, standing behind him, frowned. Eleanor looked up with interest. Eliza didn't answer right away. She gazed out the large window behind her desk. The city below was a blur of motion and noise. After a long moment, she spoke. Yes, just one word, but it made Carter freeze. She continued, The day you proposed to me, I was so happy. A memory flickered in her eyes. That day, he had stood on her doorstep with a huge bouquet of flowers. He had said, I'm not as rich as other guys, but I promise I'll work hard to give you a good life. She had believed him. She believed that as long as they tried together, everything would be okay. But Eliza sighed softly. Love can't survive on its own. She looked at him. In 3 years, you never once took my side. Carter lowered his head. He couldn't argue, because it was true. There were so many times he had heard his mother say hurtful things to Eliza, but he had always chosen silence. He thought that if he didn't make a scene, it would all blow over. He never understood that his silence was what wounded her most. Eliza continued, There's something I've never told anyone. She opened a drawer and took out an envelope, placing it on the desk. Look at this. Carter picked it up. Inside was a medical report. He unfolded it, and a few seconds later, his hand began to shake. The report clearly stated the results of a pregnancy test. Positive. Gestational age, 6 weeks. Carter looked up, his voice cracking. You were pregnant? The room seemed to freeze. Madison's jaw dropped. Eleanor was speechless. For 3 years, they had all believed Eliza was infertile, but the paper in Carter's hand proved otherwise. His voice trembling, Carter asked, When was this? Eliza answered very softly. In our 2nd year of marriage, a painful memory crossed her face. The day she found out, she had been overjoyed. She wanted to tell Carter immediately, but just then, she overheard a conversation between Eleanor and a relative in the living room. If that girl has a baby, we'll have to split the family inheritance with her. The words had been like a knife. In that moment, Eliza understood that in her mother-in-law's eyes, even an unborn grandchild was just a financial liability. Carter clenched the paper. So where is the baby? Eliza looked at him, her gaze steady, but her voice trembled slightly. I lost it. The room was deathly quiet. That's impossible, Madison whispered. But Eliza continued. That day, after I heard what your mother said, she looked at Eleanor, not with accusation, but with a deep, hollow gaze. That night, I started bleeding. The doctor said it was caused by extreme stress. She paused, then added, "After that, I couldn't get pregnant again." The report slipped from Carter's hand and fell onto the desk. He stood there, feeling as if all the strength had been drained from his body. For 3 years, he thought his wife didn't want children. Now he knew she had been pregnant, and he had never even known. Carter stumbled back a step, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you tell me?" Eliza looked at him, a sad smile on her lips. "Did you really think you would have believed me?" Carter couldn't answer. Because he knew, back then, he probably would have thought the same thing as his mother, that she was lying to gain leverage. The room was quiet for a long time. Finally, Eliza closed the file. "That's all in the past," she said softly. "Let's get back to the company." But Carter just stood there, his hands shaking. A single thought consumed him. If he had stood up for her that day, maybe their child would still be alive, and maybe their marriage wouldn't have ended. Outside the window, the sun was climbing higher. A new day was beginning. But for the Hayes family, the truth was only just starting to come to light. After the revelation about the baby, the CEO's office of Reed Capital fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. No one spoke. No one dared to look at each other. There was only the sound of the wind brushing against the tall glass windows. Carter remained frozen, his hands on the desk, his eyes fixed on the crumpled medical report. The only thought in his mind was a devastating one. I lost a child I never knew I had. For 3 years, he'd believed Eliza didn't want to be a mother. He even once said something to her that now made him sick with shame. "If you don't want kids, just be honest about it." But the truth was that she had been pregnant, and she had lost their child in complete solitude, with no one by her side. He took a small step back, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I didn't know." No one replied. He looked at Eliza. Her expression was still calm, but that very calmness was more painful than any accusation could ever be. "I honestly didn't know," he repeated. Eliza gave a slight nod. "I know." Just 2 words, free of blame or resentment, and that was what hurt the most. Because when someone stops blaming you, it means there is no hope left. Across the room, Eleanor Hayes collapsed into her chair, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, God," she whispered. "It was my fault. 3 years ago, she had been the one who spoke those cruel words. She had been the one Eliza overheard. She had been the one to constantly pressure her. And only now did she understand that her own words might have caused the death of her unborn grandchild. She began to sob for the first time in years. The powerful matriarch wept like a guilty soul. "Eliza, I was wrong," she choked out, bowing her head. "I was so wrong." But Eliza just stood there. She didn't approach, didn't offer comfort. She simply remained silent. Because some apologies, no matter how sincere, can never turn back time. After a long moment, Eliza closed the file. "That's in the past," she said softly. "Let's focus on the company." Her words were so practical they startled everyone in the room. But that was who she was now, no longer living in the past, only looking forward. She pushed the contract toward Carter. "Sign it." Carter looked from the paper to her face. A moment later, he picked up the pen and signed his name. With that single signature, Hayes Industries officially belonged to Reed Capital. But strangely, no one felt like it was a defeat. At least the company was saved. After signing, Carter put the pen down. He looked at Eliza one last time. "Thank you." Eliza didn't reply. He continued. "Not for the company, but for giving me a chance to fix my mistakes." Eliza looked at him and said very softly, "You don't owe me anything. We're done." A simple statement that closed the final chapter between them. Carter nodded. He understood. Some things, once lost, can never be regained. 1 month later, Hayes Industries officially became a subsidiary of Reed Capital. Under new management, the company quickly stabilized. Carter remained CEO, but he approached his work with a completely different attitude, no longer arrogant or self-satisfied. He learned to listen to his employees, to take responsibility, to be the man he should have been all along. As for Eleanor, after everything that had happened, she changed dramatically. She sold the grand townhouse and moved into a smaller, more modest home. The lavish parties and boastful conversations were gone. In their place was an aging woman slowly learning to live with humility. Madison went abroad to continue her studies. The Hayes family was no longer the glittering dynasty it once was, but they had finally learned the value of the things they once took for granted. And Eliza Reed? One afternoon, she stood on the rooftop terrace of the Reed Capitol Tower. A gentle breeze swept through her hair as she looked out over the bustling city below. Her assistant approached her. "Miss Reed, Hayes Industries is now stable." Eliza nodded. "Good." The assistant asked, "Do you have any regrets?" Eliza gazed at the city for a long moment, then slowly shook her head. No, because the last 3 years had taught her an important lesson. Some people come into your life to bring you happiness. Others come into it to teach you how to be strong. The Hayes family was her greatest lesson, but after everything, she no longer felt any hatred, only a quiet sense of peace. Eliza smiled, a soft, genuine smile. In the distance, the sun began to set. An old chapter of her life had closed, and a new one was just beginning.